welcome to episode 78 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is John Denning in Los Angeles.
John, it's been a couple weeks since we have had an episode out. Are you excited for tonight's episode?
I am excited, partly for the topic, partly because we get to shake some rust off. I think this will be fun.
Yes, indeed. So let's dive right into the drinks. Would you like to start with yours, or would you like me to start with mine?
You go first, because usually we introduce this with something of like, this is Dave Kaloran in rainy Napa Valley. And I think that would have been a reasonably fitting way to begin, actually.
It would have been. Actually, it's been quite rainy up here. It rained earlier today, as a matter of fact. And those of you in Northern California have heard all about the atmospheric river that had been bringing just tons and tons of rain in here. And interestingly enough, and I mean somewhat horrifyingly so, there was so much rain that all of a sudden I found myself in a mudslide zone. And we were being warned that there was potential mudslides if it kept on raining that could come down the mountain behind us and conceivably cause serious problems. And that was unwelcome.
Yeah.
I've lived through hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, many fires in recent years. Mudslide, I didn't see that one coming, and so that was disturbing at best.
Yeah, it's funny. Mudslide zone, depending on the context, could either be like a really fun way to spend a weekend or a really terrifying natural disaster.
Yeah.
Given that it's happening to you, I think we can all expect natural disaster.
I seem to be a magnet for natural disasters.
You are
So
an apocalyptic creature, buddy.
anybody thinking about living near me in some way, just keep that in mind. Wherever I go, there are floods and fires and other things. However, it has inspired, I think, an excellent drink choice for tonight, which is indeed a mudslide.
There you go.
So, and I think that's what you mean when you say it could inspire a great weekend if you were in a mudslide zone where everybody had to drink them.
Yeah, that or maybe some sort of like boozy hillbilly hill where everybody's just sliding into a lake or something. But I'd still probably take yours first.
That sounds like rural Georgia to me, and you and
Yes.
I both lived in Georgia, so we know what we're talking about.
Yes, it does.
But if you're not familiar with what the drink a mudslide is, it is very similar to a White Russian. So anybody who listens to this podcast knows that I would like that. The one I'm having tonight is an ounce of Tito's vodka and an ounce of Kahlua. So kind of like a good White Russian base. And then you throw an ounce of Bailey's Irish cream on top of that. So that thickens it up a little bit. And then they always have fresh cream in these drinks, but I never do. I always use milk. You throw a couple ounces of milk on there, really to taste. It's a little thick for my liking, but it's still pretty good. And it's certainly a very rich tasting drink.
Yeah.
I think you'd hate it.
I can drink about half of one, and it's basically a vodka milkshake. Which is,
Yeah, it's pretty accurate.
On paper, I don't hate. It's a little sweet for me. So I've actually gone a slightly different direction.
Yes, tell me about it.
Mine is also somewhat topical or somewhat recent in that you and I were both watching the Super Bowl a little over a week ago. Is that about when it was?
Yeah, it is now.
Yeah. And in traditional Super Bowl fashion, I ordered a bunch of random beers, usually because I have people to drink with. This year, not so much. But I was trying to support the Bucks because I had money on them. So I was looking for Tampa-based beers. And there's a great brewery in Tampa, Florida, called Cigar City Brewing. And I'm lucky enough that I found some of their beers here and got them delivered. Specifically, the beer that I'm drinking tonight is left over from the Super Bowl. It's called Florida Man Double IPA. They also have a Maduro Brown Ale. But Florida Man seemed particularly appropriate. Also one of my favorite Twitter accounts of all time.
It's a great meme in general. Florida Man's always
Yeah.
doing something bizarre and ridiculous.
Robbing a Waffle House armed with an alligator, that sort of thing.
And you actually had pretty good betting success on the Super Bowl, as you were saying you were watching that, and you and I were chatting about the game as was going on.
Yeah.
I'm a big Tom Brady fan. I think people have seen, especially if they follow me on Twitter, that I will often retweet a blog that I wrote called Tom Brady and the LSAT, which I didn't really like Tom Brady before I wrote that blog, but after writing it, I really did like him, and at that point, I kind of became like a Tom Brady fan. So I was pulling for the Bucks 100%, but. Yeah. You actually had a big win there, so congratulations.
Well, it paid for the beer, so that was good. your Tom Brady fandom is controversial. Your Tom Brady blog is exceptional. Nobody's going to take issue with that. I could hear basically middle fingers across America go up as you were sitting here praising Tom Brady, the man.
You mean in the exact center of America, right around Kansas City, most likely.
Yeah, that was the epicenter of it.
I will
But I
say
mean,
this
he's
after
pretty
watching.
undeniable when it really comes down
He
to it.
is. And Mahomes is great too. This was not an anti-Mahomes or KC thing. Watching Mahomes at times, I was like, he's actually should have made that touchdown but the guy dropped it. It was like
Mm.
just an incredible play after incredible play. My fandom of Tom Brady, though, is simply because confidence is something that is so important, and this is a guy with maximum confidence. It's related solely to football and how he views it. The rest of his life, I don't really care about. I don't like the Patriots, really, aside from Tom Brady. I don't like the Buccaneers, really, at all, aside from Tom Brady. I'll always be a Vikings fan. But man, something about Tom Brady makes me say, nice job, dude. You're good.
Yeah, there's a story of his from his early career, almost pre-career, that you've told maybe before on this. I know it through you. If you want to share that, maybe it redeems Tom Brady in some other people's eyes.
Ooh, are you talking about the Robert Kraft story?
The Robert Kraft story? Uh,
Because Robert Kraft is irredeemable.
yeah, you've got to be way more specific. I'm happy to talk about the Robert Kraft story. But
Which
no,
story are you talking about? I don't know.
this is the one where didn't Kraft come and introduce himself right at like
Yeah.
Brady's freshman year, um, as a sixth round? Wasn't that what it was? Draft pick?
Yeah, Brady was a sixth-round draft pick. This was when he was a rookie. Robert Kraft, who owns the Patriots, came up and they were chatting, and he said something like, "I know who you are. You are a sixth-round draft choice." And Tom Brady replied, "Yes, and I'm the best decision this franchise has ever made."
That's the quote. Yeah, his
Yeah.
rookie year, by the way, not his freshman year. Clearly,
Yes.
clearly I know sports.
You're in the wrong zone,
That's
son.
ridiculous. Yeah, but I mean, Jesus, man, the stones to say that to the owner of what was then still a pretty successful franchise, right?
No, they hadn't really
Oh, did
had
they
any
suck?
success up until that point. They've been long suffering. They'd made it to Super Bowl before, but lost. This was a team that wasn't really considered anything of note. And then between Brady and Belichick, they turned into a powerhouse. Which I will say, as soon as Brady left, what happened to the powerhouse?
Yeah.
Collapse City. Tampa Bay, who's been a doormat aside from a couple great years a while back where they won a Super Bowl, all of a sudden they couldn't win a game in the last couple of years at times, and their quarterbacking was really suspect. Brady shows up and they win the Super Bowl. So you do the math.
Do the math. There you go. So Tom's all right with me. We'll link that blog if anybody wants to go read it in this. I'll link to the Cigar City Brewery if anybody wants to check them out if you ever find yourself in Florida or somewhere where you can actually order one of their beers because they are quite good.
Indeed, they are.
All right,
Let's move on to the music.
let's talk music. And I'm going to let you do this one too because you know this artist better than I do.
I do, although we have actually seen her at live shows before, which I'll talk about in a second. The topic of the podcast tonight is Addenda. Those little extra essays that you write to address various topics. Might have been a problem with your GPA or a problem with your LSAT or some kind of legal problem or one of many miscellaneous things that could pop up. And so it's extra words that are on the page. And the artist we've chosen tonight is Christina Perri, and it is her song Words, which is kind of a slow song, but like almost everything I find that she does. It's a beautiful song, extremely well written. She's an immense talent. And I've seen her in concert a bunch of times.
Mm.
You and I saw her specifically in Asheville, North Carolina, at
Yeah,
Orange Peel.
I don't remember what night of the week it was, but I know it was super sleepy. So I'm guessing it was probably like a Monday or a Tuesday. You drug me up to Asheville for this. In my note, it was a no-name artist, and I think we listened to some of her stuff on the way up. Instantly, you could tell she's got a gift for melody. But
Yeah.
watching her perform live took it to the next level for me.
She's a great live
She
performer,
really
and one of the
was.
things I love about watching her perform is she just really, really enjoys what she is doing. Like it's fun for her. This is what she wants to do, and all of her albums I think are fantastic. She can be a little slow for some people's tastes. I mean, this isn't the Struts. She's not hitting the super rock level that they are, but it's just so good to listen to. And the first song I ever heard from her was Jar of Hearts. And I remember listening to the lyrics on that song and just being floored by how good they were.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't know anything about you, but this song is like making me feel a certain way. So
Dave catching feelings. But that was
I
actually,
felt good.
that's probably her biggest song, but it's one that we had considered briefly for this episode too, knowing the June scores were going to release soon and
I
hoping
know.
that wouldn't lead to too much heartbreak. Happily, we'll talk about this more in a second. It didn't. So we've gone with a different song from Christina, but yeah, she's a great artist.
Yes, she is. Now, before we move on to
Oh
the LSAT
God.
world, I know there's something that you'd like to address from our last episode,
Nope, no more
John.
music talk from me. Yeah, there is. I have to. I can't live with myself. I got to say something. Anyone who listened to the last episode may recall that Dave and I got into a brief debate about the singer who had the greatest vocal range, number of octaves or whatever it was. And you had said that it was Mike Patton of the band that we were actually using that week, Faith No
Faith No
More.
More.
And I said, oh, no, Dave, au contraire. It's actually, based on an article I had recently read, Axl Rose. You were surprised by this, and rightfully so, because it turns out that article, and subsequently me, I was wrong. It was not Axl, it is in fact Mike Patton with his 6-octave range. So there you go, buddy.
Thank you.
This is as contrite as I get, and it feels terrible.
You know, we're winning all around, though, because now we're talking about Mike Patton and Faith No More, and I feel very good about that. Mike Patton is another amazing talent, although he's really quirky. I will admit, some of his projects that he's involved in, like Mr. Bungle, are to me at times very strange. But I have no qualm in recommending any of the Faith No More stuff, especially some of the recent albums are fantastic. So
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
Well, I'll leave it at this. Faith No More is what you should have in my music trivia. Because I blew it. Thanks for nothing, Axel. Which is not the first time I've said that somewhat recently.
You've been disappointed by Axel before.
Yeah, on many levels. Watching him live in Vegas a year or two ago, I don't know, time's lost all meaning, but
2 years ago.
it was one of the worst, most expensive concerts I've ever seen, and that's a bad combination.
You flew out there to meet with a couple of friends, a couple guys that I know, and you were pretty stoked about it, as I recall. Rightfully so, in my opinion.
I actually flew out there for Halloween, and we had, now somewhat regrettably perhaps, Marilyn Manson tickets, put on a great show. Probably wouldn't want to date him, but I actually flew back to LA, saw that Guns N' Roses was playing, and flew back 2 days later to Vegas. I think I went to Vegas 2 or 3 times in the span of like 7 days.
Nice.
Which is at least too many. Like
Gambling
too
addict.
many. Yeah, I was a music addict. I'd have done better if I had just stayed at the tables.
Yeah,
Axel.
for sure. And then they weren't that good.
No.
And I saw them a couple years back here up in San Francisco at AT&T Park, and the first thing that struck me was they were on time, which was hugely disappointing because I'm like, that means it's going to be a bad show.
It's a bad show.
Late Axel is best Axel. And so they were on time, and then they just kept it really tight. And once they did their kind of set, they were done, and they got out of there. And it felt to me that it wasn't that. The passion was gone, and especially the Struts had been the opener there. And I was like, now that's passion. That's a current rock band that I would go places to watch.
There you go.
Guns N' Roses is no longer that kind of band for me.
Yeah, well, they're crossed off my list too. Well, I can tell you, between that apology and then all these Guns N' Roses memories, I'm feeling great. I'm feeling
Drink up,
super.
man.
Yeah, there's not enough beer in Tampa. Mostly because
more
Tom
your
was
Florida,
there.
man.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the LSAT world. Get out of the music feels and the reminiscing, and talk a little bit about some things that have happened both since we last recorded and what's going to be happening going forward.
Sure.
The first thing I'll say is that in the interim here, the makeup exam for the January 2021 LSAT was given. All right, that was given more than a week, about a week and a half after the very first test date, and that's kind of like their standard plan going forward, as I understand it. For anybody who missed it, the test that they used, they reached way back into the vault. They went back to February 2009 and used the non-disclosed LSAT from that year as the basis for the flex test here. And the reason I make mention of that, John, as I'm sure you'll probably add to in a minute, is that everybody's been talking about, oh, you've got to study the 80s prep test. That's where they're drawing these tests from. And when I hear people say that, I don't say anything about it because I actually agree you do need to study the prep tests from the 80s series. I think those are complicated tests. I think that they, especially on the verbal side, the language is at times convoluted by intent and design, and this is the kind of thing that if you really get comfortable with, it'll help you on any type of question.
Yeah.
But I've also seen people say they won't even draw it from any other era, and I'm like, there is a multitude of contrary evidence that shows them going back to 2009. Uh, we showed in some of our previous conversations where they pulled games from experimental sections back in 2010.
That newspaper, the newspaper game from January
Yep.
was a 2010 experimental game. I think October 2010 is where that first appeared. So clearly, I mean, these are tests back in the 50s. I think June 2009, which is right there, is like PT 57 or so.
Somewhere in there.
I think that's right. If that is right, go me. But it's right there, late 50s, early 60s. Those tests are still more than fair game. And you should be aware of them in case they do decide to really dig back into the semi-recent past.
Yeah, and what I would say is this: focus most of your time on the recent exams, especially if reading comprehension is a weakness. Logical reasoning, I find great question after great question on the test from like the last 3, 4, or 5 years.
Yeah, me too.
Really interesting. However, don't start thinking that they can't do something weird with a logic game and pull something that's 15 years old. They most assuredly can do that. They're under no rule that says just because we've been doing this means that we'll always be doing it. And so what I tell people is focus on the 80s, but sample. Move around a little bit. See if you can sense any differences. It's very subtle by and large. I think that people's ability to actually sense the difference is not as great as they may feel that it is.
Right.
But there are things that I can see in recent reading comp where I'm like, this is just being written in such a way to create problems for anybody who's reading and who isn't 100% dialed in on what they're doing. So that's why we mentioned that exam, is to once again prove the point that it can come from anywhere, even if it mostly comes from recent years, or in that style at least.
Yeah. The other thing that we got, speaking of January, was score release. That too has happened in the interim. In fact, happened not all that long ago. So let's talk a little bit about it. I alluded to this when we were talking Christina Perri song choices before, Jar of Hearts being on the table until it didn't need to be, thankfully. I found that the score release here, for the most part, seemed pretty fair, pretty equitable, or at least in line with other recent score releases. There wasn't some huge culling of high scores, for instance.
That's exactly right. And, just so we can talk about Christina Perri more, the reason that Jar of Hearts was kind of like a possible song choice was that prior to the January score release, one of my theories was that it's conceivable that we might see a really tough scaling and a really tough test overall that would clamp down on the number of scores in the 170s. We know factually that there is a high score bubble that's occurring. And the song Jar of Hearts is about kind of like this evil guy who keeps coming back to break her heart. And I was like, that's a really kind of like apt comparison to a January test that could conceivably be super difficult and break a lot of hearts. But as you say, and I agree with, I didn't feel that happened. I felt like what I saw on the score distribution and what the data is supporting now that we're looking at it is that it was a rather normal LSAT. There were plenty more 170s that got added to the roster, and we're now looking at almost double the number of 170s in this cycle than we saw last year. That's a lot of extra 170s. It's why the current cycle of applications has been so slow. It is creating all sorts of uncertainty with these schools that are not in the top 3 because they can't tell what's going to happen with their medians.
Right.
If a school had a 169 median for the last 8 years, they're probably looking at a 170 or a 171 median now, and that's making it harder to know whether students that previously they didn't think they were going to get, maybe now they are getting. And so you're seeing some wait list days where schools are putting 500 people on the wait list.
Yeah.
I think Michigan did that a week ago or so, and I was like, when you don't know what's happening, that's one of the tools that you have at your disposal to say, let's push this back. It's also why they've been so slow on decisions. It's been just dragging along. I think
people are getting
frustrated.
Yeah, I think it's going to start to pick up in the coming weeks, certainly the coming months. But I know a lot of people, even people who applied really early, are getting frustrated. And on the one hand, I don't blame them. On the other hand, this is a pretty predictable consequence of exactly what you just described. Schools don't know what's happening, so what do? They just sit back and wait and see.
Yeah, I've have people who've been like, "Well, I can't believe it. We should have answers by now." I'm like, "Not at all. They have many more months that they can use to their advantage, and they're in no rush right now because they're trying to get it right, and their jobs are on the line, quite honestly. If they blow it, they could drop 5, 6, 7 places in the rankings, and they don't wanna have that happen." So, right now, if you're not hearing back from schools, just means you're in contention
Yeah.
and they're not sure exactly what to do. I will say this, if this whole process is starting to weigh upon you and you are really feeling like very dark about it and perhaps even somewhat depressed, I wrote a blog, as trite as that sounds, that kind of addresses this a little bit. And then I shared one of the stories of one of our students about the difficulty she's had in dealing with the lack of information from schools, while at the same time she's watching people around her get accepted or get their decisions back, and how frustrating it is not to know. It might help to read one or both of those articles. It might make you feel a little bit better and help you realize you're not alone, that everybody is kind of feeling this way right now.
Yeah, we can put links to those blogs in the notes here too. I've already heard from several students who read them that it made them feel better.
That's nice.
So
I
far
love
so
hearing
good.
that.
Yeah, me too. But that's what we saw originally with the January scores. It wasn't punishing. Although, and I think you may have seen this too, there did seem to be some anomalies through the middle or the upper middle in the 150s into the 160s. I did see some people with swings that were more unexpected.
Yeah, I saw a selection, especially on some online forums, where students who'd been previously testing, low 160s, mid 160s, all of a sudden saw scores come out here in the 150s,
Hmm.
which is disturbing and annoying. And there's no way that I'm going to deny that. I can only imagine the frustration if something like that were to happen. And the natural question is, was there a problem with the test?
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, should I audit my score? And we'll talk about that in a second. This is what I kind of think happened on this test. I think that the really super difficult questions were normal,
Hmm.
meaning there wasn't more of them or fewer of them. And so the scale through the 170s was actually about what we would have expected. I do think that below 170 and in the 150s and the 160s, that this scale was likely tighter than other scales that we've seen on the flex exams recently. So you take that as one factor that can lower scores automatically. And then I also think that there were probably some mid-level questions that were a little bit trickier
Yeah.
than normal. And so if you missed a few questions without realizing it, and it means that it wasn't the tough game that you struggled with that caused you the problem. It was the LR question that you did and thought you answered correctly, but you didn't. And then the scale's tighter. All of a sudden, you can see score drops in that kind of environment. And I would suspect that if we were ever able to get this test back and look at the scaling and the questions, we might find that there's some degrees of truth to both of those thoughts there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's particularly worrisome, really, on a flex test where there are fewer samples that contribute towards your overall score. One tough passage on the flex, especially one that is maybe surprisingly tough, or you thought you did better than you actually did, that counts more than it used to because it's out of a smaller sample size, 75, 76 questions as opposed to 100, 101. So I think that's probably what led to some surprise drops in that
Yeah.
range. You mentioned something before, though, and I'm going to put you back on the spot. Talk more about it. I want to talk about it too because I think it's interesting, which is score audit.
I think we get that question a lot.
Hmm.
Should I audit my score? Okay, it costs money to do it. So let's just say right up front that you're going to have to eat the money for the most part. It's unlikely, as John, I think you have the stats on this,
Yeah.
will that it will be borne out that you are correct. And if it's the same score or lower, even, you don't get your money back. You only get your money back if the score has increased from what they reported. And maybe they've changed that on the lower, because I think if the score changes at all, you should get your money back. But I can't remember if they've made that change.
That does feel like an awful 1-2 punch, doesn't it? You audit the score, it drops, and then you still owe the money.
My feeling is Score Audit. If the audit shows something was problematic and there's a change plus or minus, that was a six. It's like a challenge in football where you throw the flag. If they make the change, you get the flag back. You don't lose your timeout. Same
Right.
thing here. But I have said before, it really bothers me that there is a score audit process on an electronic test, but I do understand there is a need for it. We do know of situations where scores have changed. But John, how likely is it that someone's score is going to change through score
Well,
audit?
here's the one stat that I have seen, and LSAC, I believe, released this, which was that for the August 2020 LSAT Flex Administration, 44 test takers requested score audits. 0 of those 44 test takers saw their scores change. In other words, every score audit for the August 2020 test, the only one I know about, came back as completely nothing. Basically, nothing happened. It changed nothing. Scores were as reported originally. So all those 44 people lost their money and wasted their time, frankly.
Unfortunately, they didn't know that when they were doing that.
Right.
But that is something to think about. It's unlikely to change, but if you really feel strongly about it, sometimes it's just good to eliminate that question mark in your mind. So I can understand it, and I've had students do it before, and I feel like it made them feel better to at least know that it got a second look, and I think that's fair.
Yeah. And we have seen, I mean, not to go too far back into the past or to dredge up what was for a lot of people a terrifying moment, but we have actually seen instances where early in the flex days, scores were misreported. It happened in a very, very small number of cases. It was fairly obvious. This was back in was it July 2020, where the scores were lost and
Yeah.
then recovered for the most part. But there were a couple of those recovered scores that were off by such an incredible margin that there had to be an issue. A guy scoring in the 170s routinely got a 135. And it was like, no way. And he complained. They went back and reviewed, and it turned out it was actually a 175.
Yeah, which is a huge 40-point error that would be pretty devastating not to find, but he was convinced that it had to be wrong. I will say this, that LSAC has said to me directly, we know what happened in that instance, in that particular case, and we now have put steps in place, protocols to stop that from ever happening again.
Yeah.
So for whatever that's worth, they have made it clear that they know what happened and they know how to stop that. And beyond that, there's not a whole lot more we can go into because we don't have any further information.
Yeah, to my
on
knowledge,
it, so.
nothing like that has ever happened again since. But I also don't know about the other tests and the score audit numbers there. I wish they would release that information for all tests because it could be, I don't think this is the case, but tongue in cheek, it could just be they picked the only time score audits have turned nothing up, the August 2020 test.
It would be interesting to know if all tests are 0 or whether every other test aside from August has got a couple,
Yeah.
or if there's some test out there with like 12 successful challenges.
Yeah, 12 of the 50 from November saw a problem, saw a change. Again,
Theoretically.
I'm not saying that happened. I'm saying it'd be good to know one way or another. I'm not suggesting, too, that LSAC has actually cherry-picked the one set of data that supports their validity or their accuracy. I'm not suggesting.
We don't know. It would be nice. Information is the kind of thing that would really help in a situation like this because it would send a message about what the chances are of success. Either way, let's move on to not now looking back at scores that have come out, but let's look at the next test that we have, which is coming up here in less than a week, John.
It is looming. I can feel it already.
I'm going to cry.
The last thing Napa needs is more wetness up there, so keep it yourself. Save your tears for yesterday and Valentine's. The next test, that would have been a horrible song now that I think about it. Jar of Hearts on Valentine's Day, basically, from Perri.
Would have been good.
Oh,
I wouldn't have had to worry about it, but probably would have hit some
message to
people the wrong way.
Yeah. No comment down here. Let's talk about February, because, it is coming up. In fact, the February test starts this upcoming Saturday. The main days are Saturday and Sunday, February 20th and 21st.
Yeah, and I'll first start off by making mention of a question that we saw quite a bit, which is, it's now passed, but the question keeps coming up. It says, when can I sign up for test times? And this applies to February and all future LSATs in the current form. What's happening is about 10 days beforehand is when they are opening up the doorways to signing up for your test time.
Right.
So the next test isn't until April, so we're not going to have to worry about this for quite some time. But if you're like, well, when will I find out? Not for a long time, but always about 10 days beforehand. And the pattern they're starting to fall into, which I think is a good one, is that on Tuesday of the week before you take the exam, or really 2 weeks before, they send out the message that says, hey, on Thursday, you're going to be able to log in at noon and go ahead and get your time. So I'd been predicting that for a while. I was really happy when it came to pass that they had actually done that. And so that is something that they have told me that is kind of like their plan going forward.
Yeah.
So it might not be the exact 10 days, or it might not always be Tuesday, Thursday, because sometimes there's other things happening. But I think that's a pretty good guide for generally what they will do.
You can give yourself more credit than that. I know you're not one to, so here I come. You didn't just anticipate this. You correctly predicted on Twitter both the day of the announcement and the day of the sign-up starting.
And I won $500,000 in
That's
Vegas
right.
for doing that.
That's right.
In my mind.
It was a Tom Brady parlay. Well done.
I wish there was an LSAT casino because I feel like I'd be making serious bank there, but
Oh, we'd be
no,
like
there's
known
just...
card counters, man. We wouldn't be allowed near it.
You think I show up or you show up and they're like, not that guy again, get him out of here. There's no LSAT
Yeah.
bets going on.
I think that would happen if we just signed up to take the test, much less started betting on it.
I really think that an LSAT casino would be kind of a cool idea. Kind of we'll just have something like that out there and be like, I put down, what day are they going to release for this? Or what day is the June LSAT going to start?
We should
I don't
set
know.
something like that up, like an LSAT bingo for the masses, and the people who win, I don't know, they get something.
Get something.
Yeah, half hour of tutoring from Dave.
Or John, more likely.
No, you were first.
Well, let's go over what the test dates are here for this February LSAT, because I will say for our purposes, there are fewer days for us to kind of like keep track of, and for that we're a little bit thankful. A week of testing is really tough on both you and I know that nobody's crying along with us, but I find it to be grueling.
Yeah.
In this case, there are 2 and 2 only main test dates, and those are Saturday and Sunday, February 20th and 21st. There's not another main test day as we've seen in the past, like on Tuesday or Wednesday, and that is because this is a smaller testing group. And LSAC is also comfortable with the amount of people they can handle on that Saturday and Sunday. So it's going to be a weekend event primarily.
Mm-hmm.
There will be paper and pencil test takers, as well as a few others, on Wednesday, the 24th.
Yes.
So we'll see what happens. But one of the things that's occurring here, John, is that with only 2 test dates, the strain on the ProctorU resources, potential problems, hopefully, even the number of tests being used, that's all less than if they have to do 4 or 5 test dates. So this works to their favor here. And hopefully the less use of resources, especially on the proctoring side, will allow things to go very smoothly.
Yeah, there's the counter argument to that, because it is just my nature, which is to say that if everybody's squeezed into only 2 days and not thinned out over 4, could it overwhelm the system? But I think we have seen that beneath a certain threshold, ProctorU can handle it, LSAC feels comfortable, and Saturday and Sunday are beneath that threshold.
Yeah, my understanding is that somewhere around 8,000 to 9,000 test takers a day is in their comfort zone.
Yeah.
I don't think they want to see 12,000 in there, and I don't think they're allowing that to happen. But we've been seeing test dates of like 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, and afterwards we've seen some comfort. And let's be honest, they're getting better at this as time passes. Everyone's becoming more knowledgeable about the system on the administration side. Even the proctors are a little bit more knowledgeable. Is it perfect yet? No. And I'm not going to stop, and neither are you, and I'm sure they aren't either, until it is as close to perfect as possible. But with humans involved, I don't think it ever is going to be perfect. It was a massive undertaking to get the Flex up and running. They had problems at the beginning. I probably was a little harsh on them about that, given the fact that they actually able to pull it off, and I've seen other companies that couldn't. But it's getting better now. The last test, the January test, there were still some problems, but I saw a lot higher rate of satisfaction, I guess would be the best way to describe it.
Yeah, me too. I think you and I are both side-eyeing David Coleman as you made that reference. That barnacle on the hull of standardized testing.
And for those of you who don't know who he is, he runs the college board and was one of my least favorite people in all of testing.
He runs it all right. Straight to the ground.
Well, why does he still have a job after all the screw-ups? But that's a question for a different podcast, I suppose.
We digress. But your point's well taken. When they start to see these numbers grow past a certain amount, they spread it out. They did this in January, which was originally just going to be a weekend test, until it ballooned, and then they added more days. So they're considerate of this. They're conscious of it, and I have high expectations for February.
It's a 2-day, it's no weekend for us, but we will be out and about trying to help counsel people and just generally assist with the process.
Yeah, we'll be around per usual.
What's coming up after February?
A whole month off. You and I both Heading somewhere
No,
trouble. No,
that's
we get a
false.
testing month of March off, but as we're about to discuss, we'll have something else going on. Uh, the next test is in April, April 10th and 11th. The registration for that test is coming up too. It's actually the Wednesday of test week, February 24th. That 11:59 p.m. Eastern on the
Eastern.
24th. You have to get registered by then if you want to take a February or an April rather test.
Yeah, so if you take the February exam, know that you don't have a whole lot of time to think about it afterwards. You have until that Wednesday to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to pull the April test. I do think that relatively soon we are going to get an answer on future test dates.
Yeah.
They had told me before that we'd be looking at sometime before the end of February, but I'm not sure they're going to wait another 2 weeks. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see it out this week. Today's February 15th. And if not, I'd be very surprised if we didn't have it by sometime during next week. So I'll be a little bit more attentive the next 3 days because a lot of these major notices and announcements come out on Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday with them.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to get some answers soon. We're not going to get all the LSATs for 2021, though. Probably just get an answer as to whether or not it's just June and July or whether they add a May test in there. When I last spoke to them, they hadn't finalized everything, and that's because they can't just pick a date. They have to talk to ProctorU. They have to make sure that they have support on their side and on ProctorU's side to actually do the administration. So
yeah, we've seen them actually even talk to schools and stuff like when are your final exams scheduled because they don't want to have that overlap if they can help it. So again, there's a lot of considerations that go into this, not least of which these days is can we host in-person exams yet? And since I know it's going to get asked, I'll go ahead and say it. I think the next batch of tests they announce, whether it's May, June, July, or June, July, August, whatever it is through that window, you're going to be flexing. I don't think we've got any in-person in our future, at least in terms of this next announcement.
I would go one step further and say I don't think we're going to have any in-person tests in 2021. I wish I didn't have to say that, but
it's a
I'm
bold
not
call in February, my friend. But
I feel the sad fact is how confident I feel in saying that. I'm like, really? I'm not seeing anything in this country that suggests that it's going away. There's new variants. I'm not seeing a high rate of vaccine, both adoption, and I'm not seeing the efficiency in the system to like get it out. It just seems like there's still a lot of questions out there. And so I feel like everything this year is going to be flex. But I would go to that LSAT casino once again and bet the house that the next couple tests that they announce after April are for sure flex tests.
Yeah, my money's on that too. April, though, is a known entity. And so the last thing I want to say about it, and you can probably weigh in on this with some extra ones, are some of the reasons a person might find April appealing. It is late in the cycle. I think for a lot of people that becomes an immediate discount of April. But that's probably not, especially in a cycle as sort of delayed or slow moving as this one, that's probably not the correct assessment of what that test can mean for you. I'm still a big fan of April for a few reasons. Number one, you can still use it to get into schools. Even as your first test, there are going to be schools that will take that exam to start this fall. That has not always been the case that you could take something that late into the year. In fact, February for a long time was a late test. But with the way things are moving these days and just the nature of it all, April still is a viable option to get in. My favorite reason, I think, to take April is money. It's a great test to boost your scholarships, to get a scholarship, to negotiate what schools are willing to give you. April, to me, has got dollar signs written all over it.
It's a good leverage tool.
Yeah.
If you go out and you can post a higher score and then come back and say, hey, I really want to go there. Since we last talked, I've posted this higher score. Is there anything you can do here? And the reason that we like it so much, John, is that we have seen that strategy used in the past and be successful.
Countless times. Yeah.
I saw people use May last year and June to affect that exact result. And that's powerful. I realize it's a lot of time and it's more money to take another LSAT, but if you can take a $200 test and turn it into $10,000 more in financial aid, you better at least think strongly about that. So, there's another reason too.
Yeah, and I mean, not to single out one, because all of these, I think there's a whole constellation of April pros, but one of them is also to just move yourself off of a wait list. We've talked about how many people are sitting in this strange purgatory right now. April can be the thing that bumps you from an uncertainty to a guarantee.
Yeah. I, in fact, wrote a blog called The June LSAT and the Law School Waiting List. And this was focused on the use of June. And I wrote this a couple of years ago, but it still applies 100%.
Yeah.
I used the discussion about how schools, a bunch of schools that I talked to were like, look, someone comes in with June and they post higher numbers. We'll for sure consider that as like a very powerful element or factor in making a decision as to whether to move them off the wait list and admit them. And I've seen now June get used for financial negotiations as well.
Mm-hmm.
If 10, 15 years ago, this wouldn't have happened. The windows closed much earlier. There wasn't this long spring, but this kind of race towards ranking supremacy has created a situation where law school in the past might have said, all right, February 1st, we're done. And then they could kind of ease their way through the spring. All the decisions would be out. Then they're just trying to figure out who they get. Now they're like, why should we do that? We can get a great applicant in April. And if we do, what's the harm in taking that person? It's also because so many schools dip heavily into their wait lists.
Mm-hmm.
They started realizing if we're going to dip this heavily into our wait list in, say, June or July, why are we cutting off the applications window so early? You know, it's all about getting an extra great applicant that you can admit and who attends your school. And if I was sitting as the dean of admissions of these schools, I'd be like, you can apply all the way into July. I don't care. I will take any LSAT. I just want the best applicants, and I don't want some arbitrary deadline to affect our ability to attract those applicants.
Yeah.
That'd be the first thing I do.
Yeah.
So
I'm laughing to myself over here, thinking, God, Dave has written a blog for every conceivable talking point. We started with Tom Brady, for God's sakes, and now we're talking about late cycle LSATs and their impact. It's like, what have you not written about?
there was some other stuff in there too.
Well, yeah, there was mentality ones midway through, and I'm sure more than that I've already forgotten. It's remarkable, man. But there you go.
This is what we do, man.
Yeah.
Let's try to cover all bases. That's our
That's right.
goal in our books and our courses. That's our goal on the blog. That's what I'd like to be known to be like comprehensive and not kind of like superficial. So
Yeah, well, I think anyone waiting for us to get to Addenda is not going to short us on comprehensiveness.
they're going to be like, be more superficial
Yes,
right
guys,
now.
please, concision.
Sorry.
There is one other final thing when we talk about the various things that we do. We should probably put out there just so that people are clear on what we're up to and not up to in the coming weeks and months. Which, in short, is that we are going to take a slight but notable step back. There's going to be a slowdown here as we continue to work and hopefully finish up this LSAT Bibles course that we're producing.
Yeah, the new video course. And I don't have a release date for anyone on that. We know it's going to be a couple of months from now because we have been delayed repeatedly in kind of like some of the primary things that we do. And we've been working on it off and on for months now. And I think you and I are both really excited about it. But one of the things that you'll probably see from us is we probably won't have podcasts more often than every 2 weeks or so, at least for the next 1 to 3 months as we kind of go through this. We're going to do all the normal ones and certainly the big event ones. For example, we'll do our normal February LSAT recap and we'll talk about the scales and all that kind of good stuff. But I don't know that we'll jump in and have one every week, probably for a while.
Yeah, I agree with you
months.
on that. I mean, part of this is clearly, mudslide contingent, both drinks and geology. A lot of it is LSAC contingent. There are things that they could do that basically force our hand, that make us come back to the forefront of certain announcements and guidances and just advice. But follow us on Twitter. That's probably going to be the fastest way that you can get updates from us about the various goings on.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things that people will see is that, I enjoy talking to students quite a bit. It's one of the most rewarding things that I do here. And so people will find me at all sorts of random places. I'll go on forums. Sometimes I just pop up and answer questions that I see. I'm on our forum quite a bit.
Yeah.
In the past, we've answered a lot of questions on Twitter, and I answer questions on our blog, as do you, with some high degree of frequency. We'll probably close our DMs because especially during the admissions season, it gets really difficult for me to keep up with. I get so many messages that I've been looking at it recently, and I'm like, I love to help, but sometimes I look up and 2.5 hours have passed, and I'm like, I can't sustain this, and not while we're trying to create a new course and to really like lock that in. So I think people will see that we're around when the LSAT is kind of like in its big moments when tests are coming through or signups are coming through. But if you don't hear from us, if you've written us or if you've posted something, it's not personal. Don't be surprised. It's just us trying to get some space while we actually are in the business of trying to create what we think is going to one of the best courses that we'll ever work on. So that's our goal.
Yeah, this thing's going to be fantastic, and part of this is just an eagerness to get it public.
Yeah, I don't want to wait anymore. Every day when I can't work on it, I'm irritated. I don't like being
Same way.
irritated. I want to be happy. So, on that note, John, we have now finally, after 3 hours of talking, arrived at the main event discussion, and that is LSAT Addenda.
Yes.
And the name of this episode is What's the Deal with Addenda? And I will admit, we have stolen it from one of our blogs called What's the Deal with Addenda, where I have answered, I don't know how many questions, but it's certainly in the dozens, where people have said, this is my situation, should I write an addendum? And I give whatever the best advice is that I possibly can in the moment. And right now, we're seeing so many people applying and finalizing applications that I'm getting a ton of questions in this vein. And it made sense for us to talk about some of the various topics that generate the question of, should I write about this? Does a law school really need to know this? So, John, let's start off and let's define what is an addendum. What's the point of it? What's it doing?
Yeah, you touched on this before, but perhaps a bit more expansively. When you apply to law schools, essentially one of the things that you can submit as part of your overall application is a note or a letter of explanation for anything that you feel could raise questions or concerns by the admissions committee evaluating you. It's essentially like a preemptive way for you to put their minds at ease or to clarify the context and the circumstances about which certain elements of your application have come to be. It's not an excuse so much, but a broader explanation to provide, like I say, context. And it can be about
Yeah.
a host of things, as we're going to see.
I like to look at it as if there's something in your application that would raise a natural question where someone reading it would say to themselves, I wonder why. You may have a good candidate for an addendum. And if it's answered in your personal statement, or if one of your recommenders have answered it or addressed it, well, then no, you don't need to. If the question is raised and answered elsewhere, then that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something where someone reading would think to themselves, I wonder why that happened or what was going on there, and you haven't addressed it elsewhere. That's when an addendum can be really useful because it can help ease the mind of the admissions committee members as to what was occurring.
Yeah. In fact, I'll
And
suggest
so,
a fun little somewhat interactive exercise for anyone listening to this. As we read the various scenarios we're going to present, put yourself in the shoes or the headspace of an admissions committee member and ask yourself, is that something that I would want an explanation for, or does that naturally seem to resolve itself or make sense?
yeah.
Because that's always the first box to me as to whether or not an addendum makes sense, whether you should write it.
And I'm going to add one more point to this.
Okay.
It's always contextual.
Mm-hmm.
The answer for one person may be different than it would be for another person because of the situation and the context of why decisions were made. So we're always going to be asking, well, what's the possible explanation here? And the explanation that you give has a huge impact. Some explanations are far more compelling than other explanations. And so you'll hear us come back to this over and over again. Well, if they didn't have this explanation, I wouldn't write it.
Right.
But they do. So it'd be a good idea to let the admissions committee know that.
Yeah. Sometimes the explanation is better than the question itself, and sometimes it's worse. Sometimes it's better to just let the uncertainty linger, and maybe they find in your favor, because the explanation won't do you any.
Yeah, and as I will also come back to, I wrote a blog, John, about the trap of why X essays. And one of the things that I shared in there is that a lot of times people don't realize the message that they send by the things they write. And it can be a trap to just start writing and think, well, this is something they want to hear. They don't always want to hear it. And sometimes they don't want to hear it so much that when they do, they're like, you're out.
Mm-hmm.
And so always think about the message that you are sending and how that will be received and whether it's a positive or a negative, because the whole goal here is to minimize negatives, explain to them in a way that it turns it into a positive. So we'll mention a little bit of that as well.
Yeah.
But let's dive in and let's start with questions relating to LSAT scores, cancellations, the scoring record, and whether or not we should write addenda for any of these particular scenarios. You
I
want
like
to
that.
read the
Yeah,
first one?
let's do this categorically. So to start with, LSAT considerations. This is a question, as I'm looking at it, this is from our blog, actually. And I'll just read this out so that everyone gets the full scope of it. Here's the question. It says, I retook the LSAT this January, but I canceled my exam as I got ill during the test. Although some say that one cancel does not warrant an addendum, I saw on a website of a school I'll be applying to that says, quote, a single canceled score has no impact on the evaluation of an application, but please feel free to explain the circumstances surrounding your cancellation. This was from Cornell Law School. In this case, should I include an addendum?
That's a valid question. One of the first rules of applying to law school is if they ask for something, give it to them. Don't play coy. You know, you're not trying to attract their interest to go on a date. This is a long-term relationship. And so if somebody says, hey, we wouldn't mind an explanation for this, by all means, give it to them. Unless you don't have a good explanation and it's going to make things worse. The first thing I'll note about what Cornell has said here is slightly irritating. A single canceled score has no impact on the evaluation of an application. Okay, great. Then why are you asking this question? Why preface this question with that information? Because you're making it seem like you don't really care, but then the rest of it is we do care. By and large, a single cancellation is meaningless.
Yeah.
However, in a situation like this, the person has a completely reasonable explanation that anybody who would read it would automatically be like, oh, completely understandable. Cornell's asked for it here. You have a great explanation. Write it.
Sure.
Keep it brief. Keep it upbeat. Explain. Don't complain. And let them know that this was just a simple situation where you woke up, didn't feel well, and you wanted to give it a shot, but it didn't work out, and so you made the smart decision to cancel.
Yeah, for
In and
anyone who
out
missed it,
quickly.
the first part of this question was, I got ill during the test.
Yeah.
So,
And so that would be really easy for me to kind of like say, now, if this person hadn't gotten ill during the test, I'm not sure at that point, because then I'd want to know why they canceled. And this is going to be a running theme throughout all these questions. Why did it happen?
mhm.
And so we're always looking for the best or most reasonable explanations. We're looking for explanations that make an admissions committee say something to the effect of, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Or we understand completely. Okay, moving on. It's a box checking function. What happened here? Oh, we understand. Check that off as a concern and eliminate it.
Yeah, the explanation isn't just about an explanation. It's about one that's really neutral at worst. To me, this is somewhat favorable towards the students. Like, you did your best to take it, you got ill, that's fine. But you can imagine a maybe analogous type of scenario where the explanation would do the opposite, would actually make a cancellation look worse because of the context of it. Like, oh man, I totally forgot I had a test that day on my LSAT. I woke up late. I was so hungover. These are the sorts of explanations that no school's going to look at and be like, ah, yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah, you're dealing with adults now. Law school's serious to them. They're looking for people who can go out and have an impact on the world. I was really hungover and I really wanted to do my best, but I just couldn't focus during the test. No, that's going to cancel more than just your application. So I would say it makes a difference what you say in explanation. And there's another explanation that we'll get to in one of these future questions I know that's coming up.
That's a good example of what not to write. Let me amend this then slightly, Dave, and take us in a maybe more extreme direction. What about two cancellations? Does that demand an addendum?
On the face of it, no.
Okay, good. I agree.
Two cancellations to me is not that big of a deal, and it is very common these days. Ever since LSAC opened up the number of times that people could take the test, which they did for about a year, we saw a lot more. We're seeing a lot of cancellations, but now we're seeing even more during that period. And it'll naturally go back down again because now there are new limitations. But it's not uncommon. Two cancellations, the typical response is, oh, okay. Like, it just doesn't, they don't know why you canceled. Were you sick? Were you hungover? They don't know. And so they're not going to start reading into it. That would be a causal mistake, just like the ones that are tested on the LSAT all the time.
Exactly.
Now, again, I would say, let's say you took the LSAT twice before getting your actual score, and those first 2 times were cancellations, and they were caused by technical problems. Totally explain it. I would immediately erase those from any future consideration. No one would even have a wonder. But if the explanation isn't as compelling, be careful.
Yeah. I took it blind. I should have studied more. That kind of explanation is really not an explanation in your favor. It's exactly what you're describing.
It sends
Perfect.
a huge negative message that you didn't take the test seriously when this is the test to get into law school. It sounds reasonable to you because you're like, well, I just didn't know. But it does not sound reasonable to a law school because what they hear is you didn't do your research, you didn't take it seriously, and, this is the big leagues. That's not the type of person we want to deal with. And yes, they don't make a full-on decision that says you're out, but it's not adding to the overall impression of you as a viable candidate when something like that is your explanation.
Completely agree. How about another one? You want it? You want me to take it?
John, this student says via Reddit, I went from a 168 on my first attempt down to a 165 on my second attempt. Should I write an addendum explaining the drop?
Oh, gosh. I like this one a lot. You've just thrown me an alley-oop on like a 4-foot hoop. This is fantastic because the answer very simply is no. Now, a 168 down to a 165 is such a minimal difference that you're just a 168 in the eyes of every school. That doesn't require an explanation, even if you feel like you've got a solid explanation. That 165 came with some technical issues. So it was like, okay, we weren't paying attention to it anyway. That's my
Yeah.
take on it. You may feel differently, but I doubt it.
No, I don't. First off, 168 to 165 is within the standard error measurement. Standard measurement error. For some reason,
Margin,
I can't talk.
I think it's the margin. But yeah, it's the
Either way,
right. What is it
it's
these days? Is it
plus
4
or
points?
minus 3 points
3?
on a
Okay.
regular LSAT. It's plus or minus 4 points on a flex test.
That's what I thought.
And so 2 scores within that range are considered to be statistically equivalent for the purposes of evaluation. So what you've done is you've really gotten a similar score. And we know they use the high score only. And so at this particular point, the 165 just doesn't matter to them. It's not that much lower. They're not really concerned about it. 168 is what they go forward with, and nobody's getting chafed about it.
Yeah. So that was again a bit of a layup. Thank you. I'll see if I can throw you one. Hopefully, much harder. Here's another one that I believe you may have gotten this from LinkedIn or someplace, but
Yeah, LinkedIn of all places.
how about that? A place neither one of us visit all that much. So if you're trying to get in touch with us there, it's probably not your best first outlet.
Yeah, let me say this about LinkedIn. There are so many messages that come in that say, are you looking for a web developer?
Oh yeah.
Or would you like to expand your marketing reach? That I don't pay a whole lot of attention to LinkedIn. So I'm happy to connect with people on LinkedIn. I will always accept, a connection request, but don't use it to ask me questions because I don't know if I'll see it. And usually I'm like, okay, what marketing person is this? Because there's a ton of people like that on there. So it's just an FYI about LinkedIn. This did come in though, and I did actually see this. So
there you go. Yeah, the rare message that's not like, hey, congratulate your college buddy on a 4-year work anniversary. I'm like, who?
that's on there
Where?
too.
I didn't even know they were employed.
I didn't even know that was my friend.
Yeah. So the rare instance of a proper LinkedIn question. Here it is. So my original score was a 171, but I had been PTing in the mid 170s, so I retook. Fair enough. During the retake, I had severe technical issues and ultimately got a 167. Should I explain this?
Easy answer. Also slam dunk. Yes.
Wonderful.
In this case, the context tells us that there's an excellent explanation for the 167. They weren't worried about it in the first place, but this erases anybody in the entire land of law school admissions who might have thought twice about it. My big concern, by the way, for somebody who's in this position is somebody who started off like a 171 and then got a 158 on their second test and has no explanation. That's something where a 13-point drop would be something they would question. Like, why did that happen? To me, having done this for a long time, those are two materially different LSAT scores. And I would expect that what's going to happen is there's going to be some story of, bad news was given to me right before the test or around the test. There was a technical issue. Something occurred to actually cause that. So the couple of points, 3 or 4, normally doesn't mean anything. Once we start making really big drops, hopefully that's not anybody who's listening, but if it is, then they're going to be looking for an explanation there.
Yeah, as opposed to, I was more surprised than anyone. I can't believe it either. Have an explanation for these things. We get a lot of these questions on our forum. Let's hit a couple of those.
All right.
I'll give you one
You
again,
want?
or do you want
I'll
to take
read.
it? All right, you do this.
I'll
We'll
read this one
alternate.
for you.
Fair enough.
All right. So here's a forum question. It says I took the LSAT 4 times, and I did the following. First test was a cancel. Then I got a 158. Then a 162, and then on my last and final exam, a 166. Should I write an addendum?
If you're plotting those out, it is a straight line in the right direction. 4 points after cancel. No, I wouldn't write an addendum to this. This is a
Me neither.
completely natural, normal growth curve. I mean, it's a fairly enviable one for 8-point growth from already a pretty good score. The cancel they're going to ignore, and then the next 3 tests show exactly, if I'm a law school, what I would hope to see. This person continues to work hard, they continue to improve, they continue to perform better and better. What more could you want in a law school student?
Yeah, when I look at that increase, you know what it looks like to me? Normal.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't raise questions. This kind of thing is standard. One of the follow-up questions on this would naturally be, what about the fact that I took it 4 times? What about it? You know, again, 10 years ago, this would be a problem. These days, no. I see people with 4, 5, 6, 7, even 8 takes on their record right now applying to law school. Your 4 takes don't stand out as something that's highly unusual. You get to like 6 and 7 takes, you probably do need to address that and say, well, why did you take it so much? They're going to want to know why. You know,
Sure.
why couldn't you let it go? What made you come back over and over again? Turn it into a positive. You know, you got perseverance. You weren't willing to let it kind of like beat you until you mastered it.
Yeah, I know my full potential. I refused to stop until I reached it. And as it turns out, I did. Here you go. That's me.
All right, next question.
Okay. I'll take this one for you. So my first LSAT was a 151. My second was a 160. The only difference, I love this. The only difference was I didn't take it seriously the first time. Should I write an addendum explaining that?
Please do not. Do not write an addendum saying you didn't take it seriously the first time. The signal that you send, albeit unintentionally, is deeply negative. Secondly, 151 to 160 is an excellent jump, especially percentage-wise.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right, you really made a big percentage jump, and you know that's the hardest 10, 9, 10 points to move up on the whole scale. You know, anything that's kind of like mid 140s to the 150s or 150 up to 160, these are big jumps with a lot more questions answered correctly.
Mm-hmm.
But it is 9 points. You haven't even hit double figures. And the way it works is that typically for law schools as well as LSAC, if you're 10 points or less, it's not considered anymore to be a huge kind of like, wow, how did that happen? We never see that. We see a lot of this today in terms of like improvement, and that's because test prep in general has gotten a lot better, and LSAT prep has certainly got a lot more tools that are available to people. And so for me, I would not be writing an addendum about this.
I'm with you. It's a bit like speeding tickets. Anything over about 10 miles too high, that's when you're really in trouble. This is a completely normal, I think, or at least not demanding an addendum type of growth, and definitely not the explanation that you'd want to present to a law school.
All right, let's go to the last question here.
Okay.
This was from our blog. I think it's the same. What's the deal with Addenda? Like I said, there's a ton of questions there, and I picked out a few. I had a pretty huge jump. 165, then 163, again 163. Notice right now it doesn't seem like there's a huge jump.
Wait for it.
And then a 177.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the person getting that 177 back after those first 3 scores? That must have been like pure elation.
Yeah, that's a great day. To put it mildly.
The screaming in that house was probably quite loud. The 165 was exactly 1 year apart from the 177. The 163s were about 9 months after the 165, but during a time when I lost a family member. It was a very difficult time for me, and I felt pressure to take the test despite my grief, so I could apply it early. Should this person with this score pattern write an addendum?
Yes, wholeheartedly yes, and for 2 reasons as I see it. First, I think that score increase, 3 scores really clustered around the mid to lower mid 160s, and then this enormous jump, 12 to 14 points, depending on where you count it from, to 177. That alone, to me, I think, demands an explanation. But
Agreed.
yeah,
100%.
point two of that is the explanation that they provide as part of this question. Thank you for that. That helps us. Is a quite good one.
Yes. This is a very legitimate explanation, and anybody reading it would be like, okay, that affected them. I think there's a further question of like, if you knew you were being affected, why did you make a decision that maybe wasn't the smartest one? But you're going to write that off to grief if you're a normal human. And all jokes aside, the people on these admissions committees are typically pretty normal humans. And if you were to come across somebody's record and you saw this, just imagine somebody posted this on a forum and you saw 165, 163, 163, and then 177, you would be asking what happened. Well, that's exactly the case with the admissions committee members as well. They're going to be like, what happened here? They're going to be interested in that. So it wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing to be able to kind of like add to that, the extra time that you had to study did have an effect, and that helped you to score better, even despite the grief that you'd felt earlier. So I'd focus on the grief as an explanation, in part for the lower scores, and then try to add a little bit that maybe gave them a little more insight as to why you were able to jump that much.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a perfect example of exactly the sort of question-raising statistics that we referenced earlier.
Perfect. Let's close off the LSAT discussion.
All right.
I think that gives everybody a pretty good standard to say, do I need to write one? And what kind of explanation do I have? And can I bring this together in a way that answers the questions that are coming up here?
Cool.
Let's move on to GPA.
The other big number. All right. GPA. I'll take the first one. See what you think. And these are a little longer, as is usually the case when people talk about 4 years of school. So my sophomore year, spring semester, I had a really bad semester that affected my entire undergrad GPA. I went from a 3.8 to a 3.3. Even though I retook the courses and did better, and my undergrad GPA ended up at a 3.5, LSAC factors in the original grades, making my CAS GPA a 3.3. The drop in my grades was due to me taking brutal science courses, such as organic chemistry, and realizing science was not for me, as well as very serious addiction issues of one of my family members that took an emotional strain on me, and ultimately my academic performance.
There's a lot to unpack there.
It is a lot.
The short answer here is, should I write one? Yes.
Yeah.
All right, you're going to need to explain this. Then let's go back a little bit and provide some context for what's happening with the GPA here. So they'd been doing all right, 3.8s. Then they had a bad semester that dropped their entire GPA down to 3.3. They're not saying they had a 3.3 semester. They're saying that it was considerably lower in order to drop it down half a point. So I'm assuming we've got some, C's, D's, maybe an F in there as well, at least one. So this person retook their courses, the ones they'd done poorly at. And of course, the way it works is as follows. At the typical school, if you have a grade where you failed a class and then retake the class and get a higher grade, say an A, well, they substitute in the new grade. So they remove the 0.0 from the F and they put in a 4.0. All's well. Your GPA looks solid. You continue on. You've recovered and you move forward. When you go to apply to law school, you send all of your information into CAS, all right, which assembles all the information. CAS has a very interesting procedure that they take with transcripts that come in with this situation. If that F is still on your transcript, and it is at most, even if your undergraduate institution does not include the F in your grades, CAS will. And that will become your master law school report GPA. That is the GPA that law schools use and report in their 509s. And so as we look at this, I think I've always hated this policy, but it's been around for years and years and years. And it's sometimes a very terrible wake-up call where people get their GPAs back and they're like, I was a 3.5, but now I'm suddenly a 3.3. And that's what's happened here.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's occurring. Now let's look at the explanation for what happened. There was a really bad semester that caused all this to occur. One of the reasons was a very serious addiction problem by a family member. This is what you're going to rely on in your explanation. This is going to be your lead as to like, look, I was doing great overall. I had one bad semester. Let's talk about it. First, I was dealing with a family member who was addicted, and anybody who's ever dealt with that before knows that that is time-consuming, troubling, and emotionally wrenching. You can also mention that on top of that, you were taking some really difficult classes. And everybody who's dealt with the university knows that organic chemistry is a rough separator course for future doctors. It is never easy.
Yeah, you can't see me raising my hand over here, but I've run that gauntlet.
Yeah, you and your bio. What is your major in bio?
Let's not get into it. I'm having bad enough flashbacks to Guns N' Roses.
No, you're not. You're a molecular biology major. I don't want to
have
hear
a
about your
degree.
flashbacks.
I do have a degree.
Did I
in
get that right?
biology. You did, yeah. But I mean, there's 5 semesters of calculus and 3 semesters of chemistry. Yeah, it's just endless.
Sometimes it's amazing that we can
God.
even have a conversation.
There's an MCAT under there. Well, yeah, that's probably still up for debate. But take your point. But I will say this as someone who's been through that. Not only do they make a fair point that it is difficult to go through, and it's a weeding out course. I mean, that's part of the reason it's there, is who can actually withstand it. It's probably not the sort of thing that I would hang my explanation on, as I gave this to law schools. You know what? Academically, I just couldn't quite cut it in what I had chosen to do. That's not the best message to send, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would use the family grief issue and addiction problem as the main vehicle, and then say this was exacerbated because I was indeed taking some very challenging courses, and no one's going to question that. And you can perhaps wrap it up with a comment, kind of comment that says one of the benefits of what happened to me was that I learned quite demonstrably and clearly that science wasn't the pathway I wanted to take. So I consider that a silver lining. Always try to show you've learned from the situation, that you've moved on, that it's not going to happen. And that's whether it's the GPA, the LSAT, legal issues, whatever it might actually be.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's led me to you, law school.
Aw.
I know.
Next question. I'm not sure if I should write an addendum for my GPA. I took multiple dual enrollment courses during high school and did not do well. I was dealing with my parents' divorce and my house being sold. However, once I was in college, I graduated with a 3.89, but LSAC has calculated my GPA to 3.66 because of my dual enrollment credits when I was in flippin' high school.
Yeah, I'm glad you put the emphasis at the end, because you and I feel the same way about this. That anything you do in high school can follow you around 5, 6, 8, 10 years later. To me, feels just brutally unfair.
Yeah, I really hate this, and this for sure requires an addendum because, look, the law schools still have to use the 366, but at least they understand that, hey, you really had us 389. We don't get to report that because of these high school classes. But anyone listening to that explanation would say to themselves, oh man, that's terrible. That's what you want.
Yeah.
That's a sympathetic note being sounded over your application. That's a positive for you. And so for sure, explain this. Again, another policy I hate. I think anything from high school should not count, but whatever.
I'm thinking I just want to burn my yearbooks, much less my transcripts from high school. My gosh, man.
Seriously, man.
That is a heavy weight to be burdened with. But again, a sympathetic one. Schools will get it.
All right.
One more?
Yes.
All right. Here we go. I took the LSAT in January and got a 154, which I know is on the lower side. Debatable. And my GPA from undergrad was a 393. I have a history of performing average or slightly below on big tests, like the SAT. So I was wondering if I should write an addendum discussing how I don't typically do well on big tests, but always do well when in class exams. Or should I not write an addendum?
Easy answer here. Write this one.
Write it.
A lot of the things that happen in high school don't matter. We just saw a discussion where someone took college courses while in high school and it did matter. This is another example where you could use information from high school to your advantage. There is a certain type of person, fairly common applying to law school, that is got a really high GPA, but just isn't great at standardized tests.
Yeah.
So this is nothing abnormal. It's very, very common. And it helps to be able to tell law schools that, look, my best work doesn't come on a standardized test with 5 answers. I'm much better in an essay test or midterms or whatever the case may be, which, by the way, is how tests are given in law school. So what you would do here is very specific. I would go back and I would say, what was your high school GPA? What was your SAT score? What was your college GPA? What is your LSAT score? And what you're looking for is a pattern where your high school and college GPAs are very high, In this case, the college GPA that we have is 393, and your standardized test scores are relatively lower. In this case, the person's score is a 154. This makes a compelling argument that says, look, I perform great when I'm in school. You put me on one of these standardized tests, it's just not my thing. That's completely normal. You see this with a lot of international applicants, by the way.
Yeah.
I once worked with a guy who was a London School of Economics student. Brilliant, crushing it there. Involved in all sorts of kind of like papers with various professors, doing some groundbreaking work. The LSAT, he'd never taken a standardized test. It was a total mystery to him how it worked. He just couldn't get it. We spent hours kind of going through the process of like, look, this is just the way that it works. These are the rules and the constraints. And he slowly was able to kind of like get up to where he needed to be. But it took a long time. And this guy was brilliant. So this is not an abnormal situation. If you have this kind of track record, detail it and explain to them, and close with the idea that, my LSAT score is not going to be predictive of how I do in law school, but my GPA sure is.
Yeah, I'm sure readers or listeners will be shocked to hear that you have written several blogs on classic reverse splitters. People just like this. Schools that are friendly to them, what they should do, how to emphasize and de-emphasize their various elements and aspects of their application. So, again, if you want to read more about this, Dave, as usual, has got you covered.
Thanks, John. I didn't know this was going to be a discussion of my many blogs.
I didn't either, but I'm really glad it's turned into that.
Let's move on from GPA, because I think once you start getting into it, you begin to see that it's very similar to the LSAT in terms of what's going on. Let's move to employment questions, of which I have gotten a rash of questions due to COVID-19. I'll read the first two, John, and then let's talk about them. The first two are very similar. I have been unemployed since January 2020. I quit my job to focus more on preparing for law school. And I did intend on finding a job with a lighter workload, but unfortunately I haven't been able to find one due to no positions being open because of the pandemic. Should I write an addendum explaining this employment gap? All right, that's the first one. The second one is very similar.
Okay.
I've been out of work since August 2020. I was laid off due to COVID, and I've been able to focus on applying to law school since then instead of working. This is the only gap on my resume, which has about 8 years of work experience. Would you recommend writing an addendum for this?
Yeah, I see why you've grouped these two together, because the answer to both is the same, because the circumstances are really the same. I would not think an addendum for either of these was necessary. Schools are going to understand. First of all, I don't think schools would judge anyone too harshly for, say, a 9-month gap in employment anyway. But these days in particular, I mean, this is the new normal, if anything. This is more common than not of late.
I've had multiple conversations with deans about this now, and they're seeing a ton of it. It's not raising any flags to them because they know what's happening. And they're not saying automatically, oh, this is why you're going to law school. They just look at it and they're like, we are in a national crisis, really an international, worldwide crisis. And people losing their jobs is exactly the kind of side effect that is to be expected. It's not a negative. And so we're not going to dock anyone any points for that. Certainly the person in August, looks completely normal, like, hey, I'm getting ready to go to law school and I've left my job. And you don't have to necessarily be like, I was laid off from this position. I'm not out there disclosing that. Just like I wouldn't necessarily be disclosing I got fired.
Right.
As the way things work. And the 9-month one, I know that feels more concerning. It is not. It is still 2020. Right. And there is not this belief. Yeah, there's not something that says like, oh boy, just because it was a little bit longer, 9 months, 10 months, however long we are at right now, they probably applied earlier. I don't see that as an issue at all. Neither one of these require an explanation, in my opinion, because there's an obvious explanation outside everyone's door with the pandemic.
Yeah, inexplicable gap in your resume from 2014 till now, that probably does warrant some kind of explanation.
You can't write that off to the pandemic entirely.
Right. Let's do one more.
All right. Yes.
Again, a similar situation, but a slightly different preface. So here we go. I spent a few years in tech startups and got fired twice, leading to one small, 1 month, and one large, 9 months gap on my resume. Question is, do I need to address the gaps with an addendum? And if so, how much detail, and do I need to tell them I got fired?
Well, certainly a 1 month gap, that one immediately can be dismissed. No,
Yeah.
you don't have to. The 9 month, I actually don't think needs to be explained either. Although, again, if there's a really convenient explanation, and here we know the real explanation, but let's just say for somebody else, you're like, I had to take 9 months off for work because I was in a car accident, and I decided I couldn't work during that period of time, and so I'd quit my job, and I was just waiting. Well, go ahead and explain that. If you had any concern whatsoever about the 9 months being an issue, and it wasn't going to be an issue, now you know for sure it's a dead issue. Now, so here I would say no overall. How much detail do I need? Not a tremendous amount, none in my opinion. But this last part is what really triggers me in terms of like a discussion point. Do I need to tell them I got fired? No,
Yeah. Hard, all capital, no.
you do not. This is about like disclosing what is useful to you and what is required to be disclosed. If you've had a legal issue and it says, did you have legal issues? You better disclose it. Even if it's not in your best interest, you always disclose legal problems when asked for them. Being fired isn't a legal problem, it's something that's happened to most people. And so, consequently, you're not under any, unless there's a question on your application that I've never seen that says, have you ever been fired from a job? I've yet to see that one. If they
Right.
did ask that question, yes, you need to tell them. Otherwise, no. I wouldn't even address it. You're doing yourself no justice, no service, no benefit in talking about that.
Yeah, so much of this is the presentation, and I'm glad you actually make the style a point. You also reference legal issues, which is one reason that addendum often gets sent. Addenda. It's sort of the difference in like, yeah, you know what, I had a little bit of a trouble. At 19, I made a stupid decision and got caught shoplifting from a store, but I haven't had an issue since. Versus, I haven't been caught since. It's all about how you present these
I'm
things.
the best criminal.
That's right. Now, in my estimation, I'd be like, how are you pulling it off? But for schools, like, they see these two differently. Even though it's the exact same circumstances, how you present yourself in these makes a world of difference at times. Be mindful of that.
Yeah, and if you do have to address something, like let's say getting fired really was a life-changing thing and you end up talking about it, it's okay. Especially if you show that you learned from it. The key thing here is to show growth and progress in a positive manner. You start doing that on an application and you're giving yourself some nice positives that they can hold on to and remember when they're considering you later on and the decision they're going to make.
Perfect.
Let's I think, the employment questions have largely been about gaps, and I think that addresses that pretty well. Let's move to kind of like a miscellaneous grouping of questions. And we're
Fair enough.
getting close to the end here. But I think we got about three more topics that we'll cover with a single question each.
Okay.
Let's start off with the very first one.
Yeah, I'll read it and then you tell me what you think.
Alrighty.
So, a Twitter message is discussing learning disabilities like dyslexia, ADD, or ADHD appropriate for addenda, and is bringing them up more helpful or harmful?
This is a really interesting question, and I'm really glad that it was asked because it's the kind of question that a lot of people have. And in prior days, it used to be the case that if you took the LSAT and you had special accommodations for the test, your exam was flagged, and law schools were aware of that, was the circumstance. So there were natural questions that came up. But that stopped a number of years ago. And so LSAC is not going to disclose to schools if you had any special accommodations or circumstances. They're not going to tell schools anything about any medical conditions. And so this is entirely upon you as to whether or not you would address it. In general, my take on this is that you should be very careful about addressing it because it's hard to make this something that would be seen as a positive to the school. As in, what's the benefit to you as an applicant? Um, for example, if you say dyslexia caused a low LSAT score, a school would turn around and say, but why didn't you get accommodations? There are, methods to kind of like level the playing field here. And so I can think of some circumstances where it would be appropriate to talk about it, but I don't know that there's necessarily a reason to just start talking about it in an addendum.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I don't know that I need to use it to explain any particular event. That said, let's imagine that I could say something along the lines of, look, my very first semester of college, I had a very low GPA. And this is when I discovered that I had ADHD. At that point, I proactively took steps to address it both medically and, mentally. And I was able to get myself in a position where it is no longer a concern or an issue. And since that point in time, my GPA has been outstanding. That explains a low semester, and it also, you've disclosed that you have ADHD, but you've done so in a way that says, I've got this. That's a positive way to handle something like this. And so I could see it in that circumstance, but it's going to be really contextual here.
Yeah, volunteering this without context, I would say, is a bad idea.
I'd have to agree. And this is a question that I was thinking about in relation to this episode, and I asked a few people who I trust in both the kind of like the law school admissions world and on the legal side, and they all agreed. They're like, it's not that it's a positive or negative to us, but we always ask, what is the advantage to you as an applicant? If you can use it to your advantage, disclose it. But otherwise, it's just another thing that isn't really doing a whole lot for their ability to kind of like make a decision here.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, John, let's go to the next question, which is about extracurriculars.
I dig it. All right, you go.
I'll read this one. You
I'll
read the
answer.
last one.
All right.
As an older 32 law school applicant, I am particularly grateful for the assistance getting my head back into the academic game. And I wanted to read that because it was a nice thing they said.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Also, 32 is not old, so we're not accepting that part of what you said. I didn't have an active extracurricular resume, as I am sure many accomplished law school students did. My family is poor. I worked multiple jobs to make ends meet throughout both high school and college. I have been in the workforce for 10 years, and I've had a successful career. Do I need to address my lack of extracurricular as a student in high school and in college?
Yeah, that's a very good question. My first response when I hear this, especially that middle bit that you read, I didn't have any extracurriculars because I was too busy working multiple jobs. It's like, dude, that was your extracurriculars. Those count.
Yeah.
I had, 2 jobs through college, through high school and college. You had extracurriculars. It might not have been, club flag football, but you were still doing something. In fact, I would argue that you were probably doing something more beneficial to yourself and others than someone on the field hockey team. No offense to field hockey players.
Or the social chair at their fraternity.
Or that. I take slight issue with that one, but I take your point.
Love it.
It felt like an unintentional dig. So, yeah, I mean, if anything, I don't think this is something you apologize for. If you wanted to write an addendum for this, I think you could very easily point out exactly what the circumstances were and what you were doing to fill that spare time outside of the classroom, because if nothing, this, I think, speaks very highly of the applicant, the youthful applicant.
I would have to agree with that point that you're making there, which is this person is looking at it as if the glass is, half empty. But you did actually have an extracurricular path. I will go back one step here and say you don't need to talk about your extracurriculars in high school.
Right.
Largely, what you do in high school doesn't apply to applying to law school. You're a full school away from that at that point. And so they really don't need to know most of that information. Although there are occasions, as we've already talked about, where high school information can be helpful or may have an impact upon your application. In a situation like this, the real key is that the person's been working for 10 years and has a successful career. That's clearly going to be the focus. When you're 10 years out of school, what you did in college becomes a lot less important. Yes, they still have to rely upon your GPA, which is, again, stupid and ridiculous 10 years later, but that's how the process works. They have to have a number to hang their hat on. But it is not likely that your extracurriculars will be a huge issue. But if you go through it and you're like, look, I don't have any, write the addendum and explain exactly what's going on. Everything in here is I think relevant here. My family is poor. I worked multiple jobs. I had done this from high school and through college. This was the normal thing for me. I had to do it. Anybody who reads that will say to themselves, oh, yeah, I'm not going to be, out on, playing flag football if that's the case.
Right. Now, like I said, if anything, I think that adds an extra element, a positive element to this application.
Agreed.
So, yeah, I liked reading that one. I'm like, do yourself a favor and write an addendum.
Let's go to the last question of the night.
All right, I'll read it, and then you take us home. So this is more, we get so many of these questions, or it comes up enough that let me just frame it in a broader contextual or more generic sense, which is, what do you do if you have passed, you mentioned legal before, or disciplinary infractions, things that schools often ask or demand you disclose, but how do you handle a past problem basically that you've had either academically or with the law, not in terms of your grades, your GPA, but in terms of actual behavior?
Okay. And as you said, we get a lot of questions that relate to this particular topic. The first point is this, is why are you talking about it? Is it because they have asked the question and you have to disclose it? Perfect. Then you're going to need an explanation, and you most assuredly should write about it. So you get into a section in these law school applications where they're like, tell us about past problems, if any. I always tell people, read those very carefully. Make sure that what they are asking for is what you are providing. Sometimes they use the word arrested. Sometimes they use the word charged. Sometimes they say infractions. Sometimes they use different words. And so,
Yeah, misdemeanor is one that I see sometimes.
Yep, read what they say literally and answer the question fully. If there's something that falls under what they've asked for, don't try to hide it. Always disclose. That is the number one rule. And the reason is this, is later on, if you haven't disclosed, it's a possible character and fitness issue when you hit the bar. Nobody wants to go to law school and then run into some kind of delaying factor when they get to the bar. So if it is quite clear that whatever you did or whatever occurred falls under the question, answer it. Usually at that point, you're in a position where you're writing a statement of some sort. It might be an addendum. It might be an actual, hey, you're going to have to explain this. It always goes back to the same thing that we were talking about before. Explain it as a positive. It happened. Don't deny it. Don't try to make excuses. Be very clear about it happened, and this is a situation where I learned from it, and I've moved forward, and, I'd be the last person to think this is the case, but it turned out to be a really good thing for me. I know a student who got a DUI and ended up really talking about it quite a bit, and he was able to very compellingly explain how much it taught him and how much of a better person he became thereafter. Ended up a top 14 school. So it's not disqualifying to have this type of issue. What you do want to be careful about is thinking, I need to tell them about my traffic tickets that I got. Or something minor that happened that isn't really being asked for, but I'm worried that they might find out about it. If they asked for it, then give it to them. If they didn't, you're not under any obligation. You can later on say, look, the language says this doesn't qualify. I mean, learned people can disagree and debate these types of things. So if you have something where there's a minor infraction that's come up, nobody cares. And on that note, by the way, I've been asked by several different people in the last 2 weeks about reporting infractions on these legal request questions. Go right ahead. If it says infraction or violation, yeah, traffic ticket, speeding, these things are infractions. Go right ahead and report it. Here's the great news. Nobody cares.
Nobody cares. Yeah.
We all have speeding tickets. Some of us have a lot of them. Some of us have fewer of them. But the truth of the matter is, anybody who's reading your application and sees speeding ticket, they don't need a long explanation. I was racing Jimmy and I needed to get past him, so I floored it up and I was doing 125 when the cop came over the hill.
Right.
It's a cool story, man, but they don't need to hear it in law school.
Yeah. Cool to your friends, not cool to the admissions board. The other thing that I'll say, and I think this final point really drives it home, although it applies to everything we've covered, sometimes there's a degree of finesse to this that goes beyond the typical applicant's ability to craft well. And that's where having an admissions consultant or getting some professional help and guidance when you put these together can make a world of difference. And we've given example after example, Dave, where someone doing this the right way does themselves a huge service. Someone failing to do it or doing it the wrong way, even worse, does themselves what is potentially a catastrophic disservice. Get some assistance, get some guidance if you're in any way unsure here. This is what we do.
Yeah, I mean, this is why we offer admissions consulting services, because there are some questions that come in and people are asking me, and I'm like, I need a lot more information. This is going to take like a couple hours to work through. That's when I'm going to refer it over to somebody who has that kind of time to work on that type of stuff. And if you're like, well, I'm not sure, and you're still thinking about it, listen to this podcast again and kind of like go through the points that we've made about how to make the decisions here. Read the blog, What's the Deal with Addenda, and most kind of like importantly there, read the questions and answers below it. I have answered dozens of questions about whether or not someone should or should not write an addendum for various circumstances. Good chance that if you have an issue that it will be covered there. And if not, if none of that actually suffices and you're still uncertain, that's why we do admissions consulting. So hopefully this gives you a great template to figure all of that out. And if not, it gives you a pathway where you can get assistance to actually figure out the best way to do this. Because you say, John, it's about the execution, the way you present it. You can really make big blunders in this, but you can also do yourself a huge favor. And you want to be on the right side of that equation when you're applying here.
Well, I have got quite literally nothing to add to that. So thank you.
Let's call it a day. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment or rating as well. And if you have questions for a future episode, and there will be future episodes, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, stay safe out there and have fun.